Hello, you're watching GMT on BBC World News. Our top stories: the US Supreme Court gives its backing to Donald Trump's travel ban. The president can now enforce new rules on visitors from countries thought to pose a risk to US security, but the decision is pending legal challenges. Spain withdraws an international arrest warrant for the sacked Catalan leader Carles Puigdemont. He still, though, faces possible charges for rebellion. And battling post-traumatic stress disorder in America's inner cities. Far from the battlefield, children are feeling the impact of violence on their streets. Aaron's with us as well today with news of a major EU move against tax havens. Aaron.
Yeah, loose indeed, because we know the European Union finance ministers, they are meeting to finalise a blacklist of 20 countries they say allows people to illegally stash cash away from the eyes of the taxman. And here's why it matters. Some $7.5 trillion is hidden in tax havens. So stay with us, because we're going to find out how the European Union plans to enforce it.
Hello, welcome to GMT. I'm Lucy Hockings. A substantial victory for the safety and security of the American people. That's how the Trump administration has described a decision by America's top court to allow a controversial travel ban to go into effect. The government can restrict entry into the US of citizens of 8 nations, while legal challenges against it continue. Critics have derided the ban as discriminatory because it targets mainly Muslim countries. But the decision does suggest there's a higher chance of Mr. Trump having his way when the Supreme Court has a final word on the subject in the coming months. Peter Bowes reports.
Donald Trump has got his way, at least for the time being. After being blocked by lower courts and revised 3 times, the president's travel ban will go into effect despite continuing legal challenges. It was a major plank of his election campaign to protect the United States from terrorism. The countries on the list, including 6 mainly Muslim nations, are deemed to pose a threat. Travel to the US will be restricted for people from Iran, Libya, Syria, Yemen, Somalia and Chad. There are also restrictions on North Korea and Venezuela. Opponents say the restrictions are unconstitutional and discriminatory because they target mostly Muslims. The Supreme Court has not ruled on the legality of the ban, just that it can go into effect while arguments continue in the lower courts. Hearings are scheduled in 2 states, Washington and Virginia, later this week. But this is an issue that goes to the heart of the US Constitution and whether it's been breached. The Supreme Court is still likely to have the final say. Peter Bowes, BBC News.
Well, how does the law affect those travelling into the US for these citizens of the 8 countries we've just mentioned? The strictest measures involve citizens from Syria and North Korea. They're going to be denied visas to enter the US. Most citizens of Chad, Libya and Yemen will be blocked from emigrating to or visiting the US. Somalis will not be allowed to emigrate and will be subjected to heightened security for travel. Citizens from Iran will be subjected to a broad travel ban, but Mr. Trump made an exception for student and exchange visas. Government officials in Venezuela and their families will not be allowed to travel to the US on short-term visas. Well, let's talk more about the travel ban and get the thoughts of Scott Lucas, Lecturer of American Studies at Birmingham University. Good to see you again, Scott. Do you believe this is a discriminatory ban?
Yes. I mean, the ban, when it was brought in January, was clearly directed at 6 mainly Muslim countries. It was drafted by a man named Stephen Miller, a young advisor to Donald Trump, who has been very hostile in his attitudes towards Muslims. And of course, Donald Trump's own tweets, including one last week about retweeting videos that claim all Muslims are responsible for violence, position his own attitudes as being quite hostile to Muslims. So both in the intent of the ban and in the way that it's been framed, yes, I think it's discriminatory. However, what the Trump administration is arguing is that there are overriding national security concerns that justify the ban. So it is the balance between those 2 arguments that will lead to the ultimate resolution.
I've worked a lot on the language and the ban itself. This is the 3rd version. Given how the Supreme Court has voted, do you think it is now likely to be upheld despite these other legal challenges?
I think it's way too early to tell. And that is that, as you noted in the introduction, this case is currently before federal appeals courts, including a hearing next week. So before we even get to the Supreme Court for an ultimate decision, those judges at the federal appeals court levels, they'll offer their own opinions, interpretations. How much those opinions will influence the judges, how much they'll be influenced by other arguments, there's no way of telling. So while I think the Trump administration can claim a limited victory in comparison with what has happened since January, it is far too early to say that they are on the way to getting a permanent establishment of this ban.
I wonder, though, what you think about how other Republicans see the ban, because what we're now seeing is this evidence. I wonder if it's the Supreme Court, Congress, which is dominated by the Republicans, the Republican Party itself, and Trump, all in alignment.
I think if we were talking about normal times, then perhaps you could make the argument that politically that alignment is there. But remember that very quickly the news cycle will move on to the question about whether the administration can get tax cuts. They have to try to pass a budget within the next couple of weeks. That's going to take over the domestic news cycle. And of course, there's the Trump-Russia investigation, which is always destabilizing things every few days. So I think for the moment, you might say, well, there looks to be an alignment between these forces, but there's just too much turbulence in Washington politics to say that the Republicans and Trump have stabilized things with this decision.
Scott Lucas, good to have your thoughts as always. Thanks for joining us. Well, with me here in the studio is Ali Hamedani, a BBC World Service journalist, born in Iran, but you hold British citizenship. You've got a lot of experience around the story, but I wanted to start by asking you how this ban is viewed in Iran.
Well, since 1979, after the Islamic Revolution, the U.S. doesn't have any embassy in Iran. So back in time, in the past 4 decades, potentially it was very difficult for Iranian people to get a visa and travel to the US. So potentially only close families, students, and a very few work permit visas were issued for Iranian people because they should have traveled to a third country to be able to travel to the US, and it was very difficult, a very long procedure, and it needed a very, very long vetting procedure. But for now, the people who are going to be affected are those Iranian refugees who are living abroad, especially in Turkey, who were issued with their asylum seek case. They are legally refugees in Turkey by the UNHCR, and they were told that they have to leave Turkey to the US. But now they cannot go. They are stuck there. There are more than 9,000 Iranian refugees there. And I was talking to them. I mean, since the news came out, they are very anxious. They are very concerned. Some of them are LGBT refugees. Some of them are former political prisoners. Some of them were about to be executed in Iran, and that's why they fled from the country. So they are like, how come a gay man from Iran who fled from being executed can harm the U.S. national security?
A real place of limbo for them right now. Tell us about your experiences the last time you went to the US.
Well, it was horrible. So it was a day after the initial travel ban that I have traveled to the US. It was last January, and I was detained for a few hours in Chicago airport. And of course, I mean, I was judged based on my place of birth, although I was holding a British passport, but they stopped me there. They asked for my laptop, mobile phone, iPad. They asked for my password.
They took these all from you?
Yes, and they questioned my belief, they questioned my background, they questioned where I studied in Iran, did I have any kind of military training before, and the way they were treating me reminded me of the time that I was arrested inside Iran because of being a journalist. So it wasn't a pleasant experience, of course.
Were you frightened or indignant?
All the time, because, you know, a week before that trip to the US, I was among those refugees in Turkey when the travel ban came in. I mean, the talks came in, and they were really concerned. And I was like, no, it's going to be all right. But when I myself traveled and I was trapped, so it was a very difficult few hours.
You felt vulnerable as well, I'm sure. Ali, thank you very much for joining us.